"You are looking at the wrong man," the CEO said with a polished smile that carried just enough kindness to hide the insult. "The person who can afford this jet will be arriving any minute." The laughter that followed was quiet, refined, and perfectly dressed, echoing through the polished executive hangar at Dallas Executive Airport, where some of the wealthiest buyers in Texas had gathered to inspect the latest additions to the private aviation market. Beneath bright showroom lights, surrounded by luxury automobiles, tailored suits, and polished business conversations, Ryan Mitchell stood beside his 9-year-old daughter Grace, wearing a faded blue work shirt, worn jeans, and boots that had carried him across more hangars than boardrooms. He did not look offended. He simply rested one hand on Grace's shoulder while studying the Gulfstream G650 displayed in the center of the hangar, as if everyone else had disappeared. Grace looked up at her father with quiet curiosity. "Dad, is this the airplane you told me about?" Ryan nodded gently. "Yes, it is beautiful." Madison Hayes approached with the confidence expected from the young chief executive officer of Hayes Meridian Air. Her elegant white blazer reflected the afternoon light pouring through the enormous glass doors behind her, and every camera in the room seemed naturally drawn toward her presence. She had spent years building an airline known for luxury, efficiency, and flawless presentation. Image mattered. First impressions mattered. Numbers mattered. The quiet man standing beside an old pickup truck parked outside did not fit any of them. Ryan stepped forward politely. "I would like to ask a few questions before I make an offer." Madison smiled, believing he was joking. "Of course." Ryan looked directly at the aircraft instead of the crowd. "Why was it retired?" Madison answered smoothly. "Fleet modernization." Ryan remained calm. "What failed first?" She hesitated only briefly. "Several components reached replacement schedules." Ryan nodded once. "Who changed the maintenance interval?" The smile disappeared from Madison's face. Around them, conversation slowed. A regional sales executive glanced toward the maintenance manager, who suddenly found great interest in the floor beneath his shoes. No one answered. Ryan quietly opened the worn leather folder he carried everywhere and compared a handwritten note with the aircraft registration painted beneath the cockpit windows. He closed the folder again without saying another word. Madison recovered her composure. "If you are planning to negotiate the price, I should mention that the deposit alone would probably exceed the value of your repair shop." A few guests laughed politely. Grace lowered her eyes. Ryan never did. Instead, he looked at his daughter and smiled with the same quiet warmth he used every evening when helping with homework or reading bedtime stories. He refused to let another person's opinion become her lesson about self-worth. Then he turned back toward Madison. "My offer is $8 million. The room became completely still. The asking price exceeded $35 million. Several investors exchanged amused looks, assuming the humble mechanic had embarrassed himself. Madison folded her arms. "That offer is not serious." Ryan answered softly. "Neither is the published condition report." His voice never rose. There was no anger, no pride, only certainty. He slowly walked around the aircraft, gently resting his fingertips against the polished fuselage for only a second before stopping beneath the left wing. His eyes moved toward a service access panel that most visitors ignored. He did not ask to open it. He already seemed to know what waited behind it. Madison watched him more carefully now. Something about his confidence no longer felt misplaced. Ryan returned to Grace, took her small hand, and began walking toward the exit without another attempt to negotiate. Just before reaching the enormous hangar doors, he stopped, turned back toward the executives, and spoke one final sentence that erased every trace of laughter from the room. "Do not let Aircraft 74 Meridian fly tonight." Then he walked into the warm Texas sunlight with his daughter beside him, leaving behind a room full of successful people who suddenly realized that the poorest man they had mocked might have been the only one who truly understood the airplane they were trying to sell. Ryan Mitchell drove north toward Fort Worth with the windows of his aging pickup truck rolled halfway down, letting the warm Texas air drift through the cab, while Grace quietly watched the afternoon sky. Neither of them spoke about the executive hangar or the laughter they had left behind. Grace had learned long ago that silence did not always mean sadness. Sometimes it meant her father was solving a problem that no one else could see. 20 minutes later, they turned onto a narrow service road leading to a modest aircraft repair shop tucked beside Meacham International Airport. The faded sign above the entrance simply read Mitchell Aviation Services. There were no polished glass walls, no marble floors, and no expensive reception desk. Instead, the building smelled of clean hydraulic fluid, aluminum shavings, fresh coffee, and years of honest work. Ryan unlocked the front door, switched on the overhead lights, and immediately began preparing a small training aircraft for its annual inspection. Grace placed her backpack on a wooden chair near the workbench before taking out her science project, a carefully assembled model airplane built almost entirely from recycled materials. She smiled proudly. "I finally finished the wings." Ryan looked over with genuine admiration. "They are stronger because you reinforced the spars. That is exactly what good engineering looks like." Grace grinned. "You taught me that every beautiful airplane starts with the parts nobody notices." Ryan smiled quietly because she had remembered. As the afternoon passed, local pilots stopped by to ask questions, mechanics dropped off worn components, and customers greeted Ryan by name with the easy trust earned over many years. He never rushed anyone. He listened before he answered. He explained every repair in plain language because he believed understanding created confidence. When the last customer left, Grace carried 2 sandwiches from the small refrigerator while Ryan spread several technical drawings across his workbench. They were not ordinary maintenance manuals. Every page contained handwritten notes, measurements, and engineering calculations that had clearly been updated over many years. Grace looked at the familiar sketches. "Is that the same airplane from today?" Ryan nodded. "Yes." "Were they really laughing because they thought you could not buy it?" Ryan folded one page carefully before answering. People usually see what is directly in front of them. They rarely ask what came before. Grace remained thoughtful for a moment. "Can you really fix it?" Ryan looked toward the open hangar door where the evening sunlight reflected across the polished wing of a customer aircraft. "I already know what is wrong. The difficult part is convincing people to stop flying long enough to solve it correctly." Grace accepted that answer because she trusted him completely. Ryan opened the old leather folder that had traveled with him all day. Hidden inside were original engineering diagrams stamped with approval dates from more than 10 years earlier, each bearing his own signature beneath the title Lead Systems Integration Engineer. There were also copies of recommendation letters praising innovations that had quietly improved flight safety across an entire fleet. He closed the folder before Grace could read them because he had never wanted his daughter to measure success by titles instead of character. As the sun disappeared below the Texas horizon, Ryan walked outside and looked toward the distant Dallas skyline. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried the weight of a memory that refused to disappear. He whispered only one sentence to himself. They never found the real failure. Then his phone vibrated for the first time that evening. The caller identification displayed the headquarters of Hayes Meridian Air, but Ryan let it continue ringing while he turned back toward the workshop, choosing to finish helping his daughter with her science project before answering the call that would soon change everything. Ryan looked at the vibrating phone for another few seconds before finally answering. His voice remained calm. "Ryan Mitchell speaking." The woman on the other end sounded breathless. "This is Madison Hayes. We have a situation." Ryan listened without interrupting as she explained that 3 aircraft scheduled for evening departures had suddenly reported inconsistent electrical synchronization warnings during pre-flight inspections. Within the next 15 minutes, the number climbed to 7. By the time she finished speaking, 11 aircraft across different airports had been removed from service while technicians searched for a common cause. Ryan closed his eyes for only a moment. Ground every aircraft that received the latest maintenance software update. There was a brief silence before Madison answered. "Our engineers believe they are unrelated failures." Ryan replied quietly. "They are not unrelated. They only appear unrelated because you are looking at individual airplanes instead of the maintenance history." Before Madison could ask another question, another voice interrupted the call. It belonged to Grant Mercer. His tone carried the same confidence Ryan had heard years before. "We appreciate your opinion, Mr. Mitchell, but our engineering department has already begun diagnostics." Ryan did not argue. "How many aircraft have reported synchronization faults?" Grant hesitated. 12. Ryan asked another question. "How many airports?" 5. Ryan nodded, even though no one could see him. "That is impossible unless the source is centralized." Grant dismissed the observation and ended the call. Ryan slowly placed the phone back on the workbench. Grace watched him carefully. They did not listen. Ryan smiled gently. Not yet. Less than 1 hour later, every operations center inside Hayes Meridian Air was filled with flashing maintenance alerts. Aircraft in Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Phoenix displayed different warning messages, yet every troubleshooting procedure ended with the same unresolved condition. Pilots waited inside cockpits. Passengers remained inside terminals. Dispatchers struggled to rebuild schedules. Engineers reviewed thousands of lines of diagnostic data without finding a mechanical failure that connected the fleet. Madison stood in the airline operations center surrounded by enormous digital displays showing delayed departures spreading across the network. Every passing minute increased financial losses, but she refused to authorize flights without complete confidence. One senior mechanic with nearly 40 years of experience quietly removed his reading glasses and studied the fault codes once more. "I have seen this pattern before," he said. Another mechanic looked surprised. "Where?" The older man answered without hesitation. "An engineer predicted it over a decade ago." Madison immediately turned toward him. "Who?" The mechanic replied with complete certainty. "Ryan Mitchell." Several other technicians slowly nodded. One remembered an old technical presentation. Another remembered handwritten inspection procedures that had later disappeared from company manuals. A third quietly admitted that nobody had fully understood Ryan's warning because the problem had never appeared during normal testing conditions. Madison suddenly remembered the final sentence Ryan had spoken before leaving the executive hangar. It no longer sounded like a guess. It sounded like a diagnosis. She immediately ordered every maintenance archive to be opened, including records that had not been reviewed in years. While technicians searched through forgotten engineering files, an elderly records supervisor unlocked a secure cabinet that had remained sealed since a corporate restructuring more than 10 years earlier. Inside rested a weathered leather folder bearing only one handwritten name across the front. Ryan Mitchell. Attached beneath it was a small sealed envelope with one simple instruction written in faded blue ink. "Open only if the fleet begins failing exactly as predicted." The room became completely silent because every person present realized that the envelope had been waiting patiently for this very night, long before anyone believed there would ever be a reason to open it. Madison stood motionless as the records supervisor carefully broke the faded seal on the envelope that had remained untouched for more than a decade. Every conversation inside the archive room faded into silence. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained sharp and deliberate. The first sentence immediately caught everyone's attention. "If you are reading this, the fleet is not suffering from independent electrical failures. It is suffering from one maintenance decision repeated many times." Madison slowly lowered the page and exchanged a stunned glance with the senior mechanics gathered around the table. Ryan had not described a possibility. He had described the exact crisis unfolding across 5 airports that very evening. The next page contained a detailed inspection sequence unlike any procedure currently stored inside the company's maintenance database. Instead of replacing expensive components one by one, Ryan instructed technicians to compare synchronization timing between primary and backup flight control processors immediately after the most recent software calibration. Beside the instructions, he had written a simple note. "The warning will disappear temporarily if the system is restarted. That does not mean the defect has disappeared." Madison immediately remembered Grant's recommendation only an hour earlier. He had wanted technicians to reset every aircraft and continue operations. Had she accepted that advice, dozens of airplanes could have returned to service with the underlying fault still hidden. She folded the letter carefully and looked toward Grant, who remained unusually quiet. "Why was this removed from our engineering manuals?" Grant crossed his arms before answering. "It was considered unnecessary after the software redesign." One of the older mechanics slowly shook his head. "No, sir. We never voted to remove it. We were told the original author had left the company and the procedure was obsolete." Another technician added, "I remember asking why the inspection disappeared. Nobody ever explained it." Madison felt a growing weight settle across the room. She had spent years studying financial reports, expansion strategies, and customer satisfaction metrics, but she had never questioned how technical decisions from the past had quietly shaped the company's future. She looked back at Ryan's letter. Every sentence reflected patience instead of resentment. There were no accusations, no demands for recognition, only precise engineering instructions intended to protect people he might never meet. Madison picked up her phone and called Ryan again. This time he answered after the second ring. "Good evening, Madison." She spoke more softly than before. "We opened your file." Ryan remained silent. "Everything you wrote is happening exactly as you predicted." Ryan looked across his quiet workshop where Grace had fallen asleep on a small couch beneath a folded blanket while her unfinished model airplane rested beside her. He lowered his voice even further. "Then you still have time?" Madison asked. "Can you come to headquarters?" Ryan paused before answering. "I will come only if every affected aircraft remains grounded." Madison did not hesitate. "I authorize it." Ryan continued. "I also need unrestricted access to every maintenance record, every software revision, and every engineering archive. Nothing can be withheld." Madison answered immediately. "You have my word." Ryan quietly replied, "Your word is enough." 30 minutes later, he locked the workshop, gently carried Grace to the pickup truck without waking her, and began driving south toward Dallas beneath a sky filled with distant runway lights. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced once at the worn leather folder resting on the passenger seat. Hidden inside, beneath the engineering diagrams everyone had already discovered, remained one final document that nobody knew existed. It was not another technical report. It was a signed agreement dated 11 years earlier, and if anyone ever read it, the entire history of Hayes Meridian Air would have to be rewritten. The headquarters of Hayes Meridian Air remained brightly lit long after midnight, as Ryan Mitchell quietly walked through the main entrance carrying nothing except his worn leather folder. The security officers recognized his name before they recognized his face. Word had already spread through the building. Engineers looked up from computer screens as he entered the operations center, whispering to one another with a mixture of curiosity and relief. Madison Hayes stepped forward immediately. The confidence she had displayed inside the executive hangar earlier that day had been replaced by something far more genuine. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely. Ryan gave a small nod. "Where is the fleet's status board?" Madison led him toward the massive digital display covering the front wall of the operations center. 25 aircraft were now marked unavailable, each one carrying a different maintenance message. Ryan studied the board without speaking. Grant Mercer folded his arms beside several senior engineers. "We have already replaced flight control modules on 4 airplanes," he said. Ryan asked quietly, "Did the warnings disappear?" Grant hesitated. "Temporarily." Ryan looked directly at him. "Temporary is not repaired." The room became silent again. Ryan placed his leather folder on a conference table and slowly removed several handwritten engineering diagrams. None of them were computer-generated. Every page contained detailed notes written over many years. One younger engineer looked surprised. "You still use paper?" Ryan smiled gently. "Paper cannot be overwritten by the wrong software update." He turned toward the maintenance team. "I need 3 numbers from every affected aircraft. Synchronization delay, backup processor response time, and humidity recorded inside the avionics compartment before engine start." Several engineers immediately began gathering the information while Grant remained skeptical. "Humidity cannot disable an entire fleet." Ryan calmly answered, "Humidity does not create the defect. It reveals the defect." 10 minutes later, the first group of technicians returned with the requested data. Ryan compared the numbers without touching a calculator. His eyes moved steadily across each page until he circled one measurement with a pencil. "There." The younger engineers leaned closer. Every aircraft crossed the same synchronization threshold within less than 1 millisecond, Ryan explained. "Your software update shortened the verification sequence to reduce maintenance time. The system now believes 2 healthy processors disagree with each other whenever environmental conditions change quickly." One engineer looked stunned. "That explains why every airplane reports a different warning even though the source is identical." Ryan nodded once. "Exactly." Madison watched the maintenance team immediately begin checking additional aircraft using Ryan's inspection sequence. Within minutes, every result confirmed his conclusion. The expensive replacement parts scattered across nearby workbenches had never been defective. The airplanes had been trying to protect themselves from inaccurate calibration logic. One by one, the engineers slowly turned toward Ryan, not with disbelief anymore, but with unmistakable respect. Grant stared silently at the data displayed across the monitors. Every assumption he had defended throughout the evening collapsed under a pattern that Ryan had identified in less than 15 minutes. Madison quietly stepped beside Ryan. "Can you repair the fleet?" Ryan answered with the same calm voice he had used all day. "Yes, but first you must repair the process that caused it." Madison understood immediately. The problem had never been only technical. It had begun with decisions, shortcuts, and ignored warnings made years earlier. Ryan carefully returned every handwritten page to his leather folder except one. He slid a single engineering drawing across the table toward Madison. In the lower right corner, beneath the original design approval signatures, was one additional signature that had never appeared inside the company archives. Madison recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to her late father, the founder of Hayes Meridian Air. Beneath his signature, he had written only one sentence: "If anything ever happens to this fleet, trust Ryan before anyone else." Madison held the engineering drawing with both hands, as though it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper. Her father's signature was unmistakable. Beneath it, the short handwritten sentence seemed almost impossible to accept after everything that had happened during the day. She slowly looked up at Ryan. "You knew my father?" Ryan answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Why did he trust you this much?" Ryan remained quiet for a moment before speaking. "Because he cared more about safe airplanes than impressive titles." The room stayed silent. Even Grant Mercer lowered his eyes. Madison carefully placed the drawing on the conference table beside the old leather folder. "I have spent years trying to protect the company he built," she said softly. Ryan nodded. "I know. Then why did nobody ever tell me about you?" Ryan looked across the operations center, where dozens of engineers were already following the inspection procedure from his handwritten notes. Aircraft status indicators that had remained frozen for hours were finally beginning to change as technicians confirmed the same hidden calibration fault across the fleet. "People do not usually erase names," Ryan replied. "They erase uncomfortable memories." Madison understood the meaning immediately. Someone had not simply forgotten Ryan. Someone had wanted him forgotten. She turned toward the records supervisor. "Bring me every executive meeting record from the restructuring 11 years ago." The elderly supervisor hurried away without asking another question. Ryan quietly walked toward one of the engineering stations and began reviewing live maintenance data arriving from Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Phoenix. He never raised his voice. Instead, he asked simple questions that gradually revealed answers nobody else had considered. Was the calibration package installed on the same date? Yes. Did every aircraft receive identical verification timing? Yes. Were the original inspection steps removed afterward? Another engineer slowly answered, "Yes." Ryan nodded once. "Then the airplanes are behaving exactly as they were programmed to behave." One young systems engineer looked almost embarrassed. "We replaced nearly $4 million worth of equipment tonight." Ryan smiled kindly instead of criticizing him. "Machines are easy to replace. Assumptions are much more expensive." Several older mechanics quietly exchanged glances. They had not heard Ryan speak in more than 10 years, yet his calm way of teaching had not changed at all. A short time later, the records supervisor returned carrying several thick archive binders together with a digital storage box recovered from the executive vault. Madison opened the oldest binder first. Inside were meeting minutes, maintenance policy revisions, and executive approvals from the year Ryan had left the company. Then she found a page with several signatures authorizing the removal of the supplemental synchronization inspection from every maintenance manual. Her eyes immediately moved to the approval column. Ryan's signature was missing. In its place appeared a typed sentence: "Lead engineer unavailable during final review." Madison looked directly at Ryan. "Were you unavailable?" Ryan quietly answered, "No," she frowned. "Did you refuse to sign?" Ryan shook his head. "Nobody asked me." The room became completely still once again. Grant Mercer stepped forward as if preparing to explain, but before he could speak, the records supervisor carefully removed one final document from the digital storage box. Unlike the others, it still carried the original executive seal from Madison's late father. The envelope had never been opened because it had been addressed to the future chief executive officer rather than any specific person. Madison slowly broke the seal and unfolded the letter. She read only the first 2 lines before her expression changed completely. Without saying a single word, she looked back at Ryan with quiet disbelief because the letter began with one sentence that nobody in the room had expected to read. If Ryan Mitchell is no longer working here, then someone ignored my final decision. Madison lowered the letter onto the conference table with careful hands, but nobody reached for it. The silence inside the operations center felt heavier than the endless stream of maintenance alerts still flashing across the large digital screens. Finally, she looked toward Ryan. My father wanted you to stay. Ryan nodded once. Yes. Then why did you leave? Ryan did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched several mechanics complete another round of synchronization checks exactly as described in his handwritten procedure. One by one, the warning messages disappeared without replacing a single expensive component. Relief quietly spread across the room as engineers realized they were finally repairing the true cause instead of chasing symptoms. Only then did Ryan speak. Your father asked me to become director of engineering after the restructuring. He believed the company needed stronger safety standards before expanding. Madison listened without interrupting. I accepted the position. He paused for a moment before continuing. 3 days later, I lost my wife in a sudden medical emergency. Grace was only a few months old. His voice remained steady, carrying neither bitterness nor self-pity. Everything changed overnight. My daughter needed me more than any company did. Madison lowered her eyes. Ryan continued. I asked for 6 months to balance my responsibilities while completing the safety transition. Your father agreed immediately. Several older mechanics exchanged knowing looks. One quietly whispered, that sounds exactly like Mr. Hayes. Ryan gave a faint smile. It does. He then looked toward Grant Mercer. Unfortunately, someone else believed the company could not wait. Grant remained silent. Ryan continued without raising his voice. I was told the restructuring had already moved forward. The promotion disappeared. My inspection procedures disappeared. Eventually, my employee identification stopped working. Madison looked stunned. Nobody even informed my father? Ryan shook his head. He became seriously ill only weeks later. By the time he returned, I was already gone. The room fell silent again. Madison slowly reopened her father's letter and continued reading. Every paragraph revealed another decision that had never been carried out. Ryan had been authorized to establish an independent engineering review board, expand technician training, and preserve manual inspection procedures alongside every future software update. None of it had happened. Instead, cost reductions gradually replaced independent verification. Madison looked toward the maintenance board where 25 grounded aircraft now represented the price of those forgotten decisions. Just then, one of the lead engineers hurried across the operations center, holding a tablet. We finished the revised synchronization sequence on the first 5 aircraft. Everyone looked up. Results? Madison asked. The engineer smiled for the first time all night. Every warning has cleared. All flight. Control systems passed verification. The defect is gone. Quiet applause spread naturally through the room, not because anyone had ordered it, but because weeks of confusion had finally been replaced with certainty. Ryan did not celebrate. He simply updated the next inspection checklist and handed it to another technician. Madison watched him for several seconds before asking softly, why did you never contact us after leaving? Ryan looked toward the windows where the first pale light of dawn had begun to appear over the Dallas skyline. Because proving I was right would never have mattered as much as raising Grace the right way. His answer left the room speechless. At that very moment, the records supervisor hurried back, carrying one final archive box that had been stored separately from every engineering file. Miss Hayes, he said quietly, we finally located the original ownership records for the Gulfstream you tried to sell today. Madison accepted the folder without concern, expecting another routine document. But when she opened the first page, her expression changed instantly because the aircraft had never legally belonged to Hayes Meridian Air alone. 11 years earlier, her father's signature had assigned a permanent minority ownership interest to one engineer whose name appeared beside his in bold black ink. Ryan Mitchell. Madison stared at the ownership document as if the words refused to settle into reality. She looked from the page to Ryan and then back again, hoping she had misunderstood the legal language. The company's chief legal officer stepped closer, adjusted his glasses, and quietly confirmed what everyone in the room had begun to suspect. This agreement is authentic. It was executed 11 years ago and properly notarized. Mr. Hayes transferred a permanent minority ownership interest in the Gulfstream development aircraft to Ryan Mitchell as part of the engineering partnership program. The operations center became completely silent. Grant Mercer slowly sat down without saying a word. Madison looked at Ryan with disbelief. You already owned part of the aircraft. Ryan answered calmly. A small part. Then why did you come to buy it today? Ryan smiled gently. Because I assumed the records had been changed after I left. I wanted to purchase the remaining ownership fairly instead of arguing over the past. Madison lowered her eyes, remembering every word she had spoken inside the executive hangar only hours earlier. She had believed she was speaking to a struggling mechanic dreaming beyond his means. Instead, she had been speaking to one of the original engineers who had helped shape the aircraft itself. Shame settled quietly across her face, but Ryan did not allow the silence to become humiliation. People make decisions with incomplete information, he said softly. What matters is what they do after they learn the truth. Madison nodded slowly. Then let me begin by correcting mine. She turned toward the executive leadership team. Effective immediately, every maintenance shortcut introduced after the restructuring is suspended pending independent engineering review. Mr. Ryan Mitchell will have unrestricted authority to supervise the technical recovery of the fleet. No one objected. The engineers actually appeared relieved. Throughout the early morning hours, maintenance teams followed Ryan's inspection sequence across every grounded aircraft. One after another, the synchronization values returned within safe operating limits. Warning messages disappeared. Flight control systems completed successful verification cycles. Pilots reported stable diagnostics before engine start. Every confirmation strengthened the confidence spreading through the operations center. Ryan never celebrated each success individually. He quietly checked every report, reminded technicians to repeat every verification twice, and thanked mechanics by name whenever they completed a difficult inspection. His calm respect transformed the atmosphere more effectively than any speech could have. Even the youngest technicians found themselves asking questions they had previously been too nervous to ask, and Ryan answered everyone with patience instead of pride. As dawn illuminated the windows overlooking the runway, the final affected aircraft completed its inspection. The lead maintenance engineer looked up from his tablet with a smile that everyone had been waiting to see. 25 aircraft inspected. 25 aircraft cleared for return to service after verification. No unresolved synchronization faults remain. Quiet applause filled the room once again, stronger than before. Yet Ryan simply closed his leather folder and thanked the entire maintenance team for trusting the process. Madison watched him with growing admiration. She finally understood why experienced mechanics had spoken his name before anyone else's. Respect had never been demanded by Ryan. It had been earned one careful decision at a time. As the engineers prepared the fleet for carefully scheduled return-to-service procedures, the chief legal officer approached Madison carrying another thin folder recovered from the executive archive. There is one more document connected to the ownership agreement, he said. Madison accepted it without concern, but the moment she opened the first page, her breathing slowed. It was not a financial contract. It was her father's personal letter explaining why he had chosen Ryan as his future engineering partner. The final sentence was underlined in blue ink. If the day ever comes when Ryan returns to save this company, offer him leadership, but understand that the greatest thing he may ask for will never be money. Morning sunlight slowly spread across the runways of Dallas as the first Hayes Meridian Air aircraft returned to service after completing every inspection Ryan Mitchell had required. The operations center no longer echoed with urgent alarms or hurried conversations. Instead, engineers quietly reviewed final reports while mechanics shook hands with colleagues who had worked through the entire night. Every aircraft had passed verification. Every warning had disappeared. The crisis that had threatened the airline only hours earlier had ended not because someone ignored the problem, but because one quiet engineer insisted that every detail deserved respect. Madison Hayes stood beside the large windows overlooking the departure gates with her father's final letter still in her hands. She turned toward Ryan, who was carefully returning his handwritten engineering notes to the same worn leather folder he had carried for years. My father wrote that the greatest thing you would ask for would never be money, she said softly. He was right. Was not he? Ryan smiled with the same calm expression that had never changed, whether people laughed at him or trusted him. Yes. Madison waited. Then tell me what you want. Ryan looked across the busy ramp where mechanics were preparing another aircraft for departure. Create an independent engineering academy inside this company. Open it to the sons and daughters of mechanics, technicians, baggage handlers, and every family that believes hard work matters more than job titles. Teach them to ask questions even when everyone else believes the system is perfect. If they protect people instead of profits, your airline will never face another night like this. No one spoke for several seconds. The request was so different from what every executive had expected that several members of the board quietly lowered their heads. Madison folded her father's letter and extended her hand. It will be done. Ryan accepted the handshake, not as a victory, but as a promise. Before leaving, he walked through the maintenance hangar thanking mechanics one by one. He remembered names that many executives had never learned. Older technicians smiled with quiet respect while younger engineers asked if they could visit his workshop someday to continue learning. Ryan answered every invitation the same way. The door has always been open. Outside, Grace climbed out of the pickup truck after waking from her long sleep. She ran toward her father, and he lifted her into his arms with a smile that no professional achievement could ever replace. Madison watched them from the entrance, finally understanding that the strongest man in the building was never the one with the highest office. It was the father who had quietly chosen character over recognition every single day. As Ryan prepared to drive back to Fort Worth, the chief legal officer hurried outside carrying one last document that had been discovered inside the executive archive only minutes earlier. Ryan, he called. You should see this. Ryan unfolded the single page and immediately recognized his own handwriting. It was a proposal he had written 11 years earlier describing a nationwide aviation education program for working families. Across the bottom, beneath his signature and beneath Madison's late father's signature, appeared one final handwritten sentence that neither of them remembered reading before. If this plan is ever completed, the Gulfstream shall become its first classroom, and its full ownership shall belong to Ryan Mitchell and his daughter, Grace. Ryan slowly looked toward the aircraft waiting on the distant ramp, then toward Grace standing beside him, and for the first time that entire day, he realized he had never come to buy the airplane at all. His family had been its rightful future all along.